This is Product Management. We feature the brightest minds across the numerous disciplines that fuel modern product teams. Join over 20,000 subscribers to learn from product leaders, authors, and executives from companies like Spotify, Humana, and Experian. They'll share their insights and best practices on research, leadership, corporate innovation, and more. To receive updates on the latest episodes, subscribe to our newsletter at thisisproductmanagement.com.
Hey, I'm your host Anurag Verma. Welcome back. On this episode, I'll be speaking to Tim McEwen. Now a senior consultant at Park, Tim was previously Senior Global Director of Innovation and Design for Wilson Sporting Goods, where he drove step-change innovation in a traditional legacy product management environment. Before we begin, will continuous feedback from your target consumers help improve your product decisions? The Feedback Loop platform can help. To learn more about how product teams are generating reliable consumer insights from Feedback Loop's agile research platform, visit feedbackloop.com. And be sure to follow Feedback Loop on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and continue the conversation online using the hashtag TIPM podcast. Please tell us about your favorite episodes, topics, or lessons learned from the show.
This is Product Management is produced by Feedback Loop. The world's leading companies use Feedback Loop's agile research platform to get the rapid consumer feedback they need to learn faster and innovate smarter. Request a demo at feedbackloop.com.
Can you share just a little bit about how you ended up as the Senior Director of Innovation and Design for Wilson Sporting Goods?
It was, I think, a shift and a decision by the company to pay very close attention to their racket sports and particularly tennis business, which was not growing at the pace that they needed it. It's a big contributor to the profitability of the company as a whole. It's global in scope, and a lot of the brand value is garnered through the racket sports business, at least globally speaking. So they knew that they needed to do something different. So there was new leadership just within the last few years ahead of my hiring, both at the company-wide level as well as within the racket sports business. With new leadership brought some new perspectives and some, leading practices from other sports brands that you would be familiar with out there, like the Nikes and Adidas of the world. A lot of business folks tend to navigate through a couple different experiences across those competitors and contributors to the sports equipment, sports apparel industry. One of the ingredients within the context of the company, which existed but didn't exist at necessarily a strategic level, was design. The role of design, the function of design was very much playing a support role within the context of R&D on the product side, and then much more around a creative marketing resource for product and marketing managers. So that really, both on a brand side and a product innovation side, design was in a very traditional role of supporting evolutionary efforts and incremental efforts around products and messaging and all those types of endeavors that you would probably be familiar with. So with the new leadership, there was a need to accelerate and grow at a faster pace, and then also put a few markers out there that would be meaningful to the industry, which is positioning of the business as being number one again. Wilson is rooted in sports mentality. A lot of, ex-athletes pervade the organization, so that culture of winning is unmistakable. Whether it's the tennis industry or baseball or football or golf, there was just a need to win and to, put effort as well as investment against that. So that's really where my introduction to the company and the brand came from, was that they were looking for someone with maybe a bit of a hybrid experience, not just a pure designer with an artistic flair or a strong personality, but someone that understood product development, the context of the business, and a broader understanding of innovation, so that there would be not just a one-hit product, but a flow of product and stories that could be told through the marketing lens that would be meaningful to the business. There's lots of different people they probably could have hired. They could have hired someone, who worked at a Nike or some other sports company, and they chose to hire someone who had a very broad-based experience across a number of different industries, whether it's CPG, fast-moving consumer goods or consumer durables or high-tech electronics with connectivity and broader service experiences like Motorola and Whirlpool. So that's part of it. And then the other part of my role was to grow the design function within the business. So pretty much a tripling of the size of the number of designers playing a role in product development was an important step. And then kind of really unifying the technical expertise that lived in the organization with a mindset around understanding where the real opportunities were in the business, as well as what today's consumers were really looking for. So I think that was really looking forward out more than just the next season, but on a 3 to 5 year kind of roadmap where you could start to seed ideas and start an innovation funnel and pipeline that could have a resurgent effect over time. But certainly a hit product doesn't hurt either. So that was one of the other really interesting parts. The first week I was on the job, I was presented with a verbal brief of, hey, we need to reinvent the tennis racket. We want to make all other tennis rackets obsolete. That's a fantastic goal and a audacious one at that, and something that can really galvanize a group of people around a vision. But I think the challenge was, how do we go do that? So that's really what brought me to the company. There was, very good capabilities already there. It was more about adding another set of eyes and ears and experiences and perspective to add to the equation.
So what were some of the mindsets that prevailed around design and product management and innovation prior to your arrival?
I think prior it was very much a product manager-led organization. In fact, even 3 years prior to my hiring, I believe the organization was very much set up where it was a single person owned kind of the end-to-end product from definition to delivery to even including, how it was going to be supplied and sold into the customer base. So it was a wide range of responsibilities under one person, including the storytelling, pricing, road mapping, you name it. So it was a very broad-based thing. And just a few years prior to my hire, the company and the parent company was really driving more of a division of labor. So a specific expertise around storytelling and communication marketing. So there would be a person just responsible for that entity. And then product management, purely focused on the product roadmap, capabilities, delivering on the business through the lens of the product. And then, the go-to-market or relationship with the customer was also highly specialized. So you kind of had these three entities that really represented what used to be one person. So it introduced a level of communication and complexity, and roles and responsibilities and understandings that were still being smoothed out at the time that I kind of was joining the organization. And R&D really always used to own the engine of product, what was going to be capable. They were the ones who were really building the roadmap of products across the different product types. The question was always, do these inventions, do these new capabilities match up to the business needs? And so there was sometimes disconnect. A lot of wins along the way, but still probably judged to be somewhat incremental because the growth of the company really leveled out and was steady for, decades, just kind of fighting the fight with, very capable competitors and not a lot of differentiation one from the other. So you're starting to play lots of games around positioning, pricing, storytelling, incremental features, things like that. I likened it very much to CPG world in terms of, constantly trying to tell new stories, new improvements, things like that, where essentially it's still the same product. So I think that was one of the big challenges.
What was the first change you made to get the organization at least thinking about operating in a new way?
I don't know if I particularly set it in motion, but what was critical for the change was a mindset around a cross-functional team working with a singular goal. And from the very genesis of the program to its end, this cross-functional team was really charged with identifying what the real problem was and identifying solutions and bringing that to market. That was probably one of the biggest changes. And they chose to do that in the racket sports business because one, there was a greater need to do something different. So, and obviously this was not a new idea in the world of innovation, but for the company, it was singularly different to, add an actual marketing communications person on the team when there wasn't even a product yet. Certainly there was product managers and R&D and design there, but getting supply chain folks plugged into what potentially would need to be expected in order to support something new. That was one of the biggest shifts. And so there was a level of empowerment that was noteworthy. I mean, there was still plenty of checks and balances along the way and check-ins, but I think, the team definitely felt like we had a responsibility to go after the opportunity and to work quickly. So there was also, it was a bit off the normal product development cadence. There was a level of focus and acceleration. So a lot of other programs were put on hold in order to really garner the best resources for this effort. So I'd say that was the biggest shift.
I think people often underestimate how difficult it is to drive cross-functional ways of working. It's changes in incentives, you need support from the leadership team. Where was this change initiated, and what role did the C-suite play in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. The C-suite drove it. The president of the company, a long-time Wilson employee early in his career, took a few years at Nike and then came back a few years prior to my hiring. And he was bringing a new mindset to the table. So I think really he was the main instigator. He was actually challenging some conventional thinking that still pervaded the organization across the product management team, across the general management team in each of the business units. He was pressing hard for faster innovation, faster change, to mix things up. And he even had a role in choosing people that he felt would add a level of challenge to the cross-functional team. People had never been involved in product development before, as an example, were added to the team. And not necessarily people with the highest seniority. It was just people he felt were open-minded, willing to share ideas, had good collaboration skill sets, and willing to give some underdogs, I guess you could say, or people an opportunity to prove themselves. I think that was probably the strongest component of it. The people that ran innovation and the business were supportive of this, but they were not driving it necessarily.
And don't forget, in 2021, This Is Product Management episodes will be transcribed. You can now download a transcription of this episode to make it easier to take notes and capture those important quotes. Please visit tapm.feedbackloop.com to download your transcript today. Can you talk a little bit about the history of innovation in, let's say, tennis rackets? What you did differently to get that number one spot?
Yeah, so two things. One was, there's no doubt this product that I'm using it as an example, the Wilson Clash, which is a new franchise, a new array of product types, different size heads and slight differences in technology and specifications, but nonetheless, all under a product franchise that delivers a fundamentally different experience to the tennis player that really supports the modern way that the tennis is played today versus in the past. So two things. Technology, as I mentioned, was a huge enabler to deliver on the experience, and looking at how technology could be applied to this product was one key difference. The technology team had lots of ideas over the period of years and would test lots of different ideas, and not all of them would work out. And this was actually an interesting opportunity to apply 3 unique ideas in combination that actually delivered a fundamentally different experience. And I'll get to what that is in a second. And then the other key component that was different was that really understanding what the real problem to solve was. So I think was maybe the biggest thing. The company was really good at coming up with lots of solutions, but it wasn't always clear what problem these solutions were solving. Like, for instance, adding more spin to a tennis shot is certainly known to be advantageous to the tennis player, but adding a few more RPMs of spin to the tennis ball through some technology doesn't necessarily equate to a fundamentally different experience. It just becomes another claim that you can make in marketing, communications, or through the selling experience that happens at retail. So moving beyond kind of this specmanship and feature set enhancements to really figuring out what do real tennis players need. And so the shift was to become more design led. And what I mean by that is really being consumer led instead of technology led or customer led in terms of, hey, we just need one more new product at a new price point or one of the things. So spending time on the problem space, the front end part of that, to really be clear on what we're aiming for was probably the biggest thing I personally brought to the table, was to get the team to focus on that first before diving into crafting lots of different solutions. I had no doubt that the technology would come through one way or the other because there was just a lot of experience and capability there in the organization, but getting it focused on the right problem was really key. So what was that? Well, going out and really talking to consumers, and not lots of them, 30, 40 key consumers over a period of a week. We brought the whole cross-functional team out on the tennis court and interviewed real tennis players across a range of capabilities, ages, male, female. They all have different needs. And what we were able to learn and identify was that the way the industry talks to these consumers wasn't really resonating. Consumers are completely confused by the way tennis rackets are marketed and sold. They really didn't even know what, in many cases, why they had their own tennis racket. They didn't know why it worked for them or not. But what we were able to learn through a number of different exercises, interview techniques, and on-court interviews and observation was that what they really sought was an amazing amount of control over their tennis game. Basically, keeping the ball in play and not hitting it long and not hitting in the net are two of the biggest reasons why a tennis point ends. And so if you could navigate that space and give confidence, so really connecting on an emotional level with the player, they could, really perform, maybe even beyond their own expectations. And even with more skilled players, the desire to really swing hard, swing free was some of the things we heard back from consumers. So hearing all this, we had maybe a slightly different view on what control was, because Wilson for 40, 50 years was known as the control tennis racket out in the world. But control was always positioned as something maybe not as sexy as power. And we require a good level of skill by the very good tennis players. Like Roger Federer uses this pro staff that I'm holding up. The sweet spot is about the size of a tennis ball. So you have to be really good to play with this tennis racket. But that's the most famous tennis racket they had at the point, was the pro staff. Nobody could play with this racket except the very best tennis players. A lot of people tried. The point here was that we were able to identify a real need that wasn't necessarily being satisfied well, and to find an emotional connection that was also meaningful, and then really to figure out how to solve for that in a way that was noticeable. One of the things that hasn't really changed in probably 30 plus years, somewhere around that, was how tennis rackets are made. Most are made of carbon fiber graphite molded construction, not unlike a golf club shaft or college baseball bats and things like that. But the point is that over that period of time, there's just been a lot of incremental innovation along the way to basically make the product stiffer, more powerful. All that did was really hurt people's arms and shoulders as they aged. Most tennis players are 46 years of age, not 26. So it just doesn't really make sense for most tennis players to continue to make a product that translates a lot of force from the ball into your arm. So what we recognized was that there was, a reason to think differently about how you could use this manufacturing process, the materials, in a new way that would actually deliver a completely different physical experience. It was basically making what had been a stiff product become a very flexible product, which is a mind shift in terms of the industry, because when you make something super flexible, it becomes very unstable, hard to control, these kinds of things. But the innovation technology-wise was about putting flexibility in three different directions. Most tennis rackets bend in one way, the direction that you're swinging. But as I mentioned earlier, the modern swing is very much about a more vertical swing from low to high. If you can actually get more flexibility in the vertical way as you're swinging low to high, you can keep the ball on the racket longer. That translates to control. So no one really knew how to do that. We knew that that could deliver the benefit, but there wasn't really a clear path for how to do it. And luckily there was expertise in technology and the other part of innovation that I'm a big fan of, which is prototyping. to, experiment and learn quickly in very crude ways to know whether you're on a path towards success or not. Prototyping has always been a part of the R&D organization. It wasn't necessarily part of the product development or product organization. So getting them comfortable with imperfect experiments along the way was also a part of the equation here. So I tell you this story because in 30 years, no one's ever made a flexible carbon fiber racket like this, and it's patented. So that was another key thing, is that no one can copy this. And so they're really locked up for a number of years now with this technology. And it's easy to tell a technology story. It's probably the traditional way the industry's operated. But I think the other part of the success of the product was the marketing story. The marketing approach was very different than traditionally put forward. So thinking through the lens of a much younger consumer was the approach that the organization took. So almost like street cred, streetwear approach to it, like sneaker marketing, being very coy and mysterious about what this technology was. And it was more about what emotion could come out of this. So how does the product play? That was certainly important, and that was unmistakable. I think there was equal amount of attention put into how this product looks to really signify it, not only within the context of a newly evolved brand language that preceded this product, which made it more visually modern and very coherent across the different product offerings as to what was what through color and through very basic but important brand design strategy. And so Clash fit that overarching brand strategy of how to go to market, but it had its own unique color, it had its own unique personality, and it basically became, like I said, the number one product, not only for the tennis business, but for all of Wilson. It was the most successful product launch in the history of the company, which is now, I think, over 106 years old. So it was very, very meaningful, and it was equal parts technology, equal parts consumer understanding and positioning, and equal parts creative marketing on a very tight budget. I tip my hat to everyone who played a role in the product, for sure. So I think that's maybe the other key message, is that it wasn't just one thing. It was all things really working well in concert.
So at the heart of this, it's a very simple idea of talking to consumers. Who was involved in that?
Well, the core team that I mentioned, that cross-functional team, we were brought together with that audacious goal that I mentioned earlier. And there's always a tendency, well, let's just start looking at what's in our collection of ideas and see what maybe can deliver on this. Or is there something in our current product range that just needs to be improved somewhat that could take them over the edge? And it was clear that neither one of those traditional approaches was going to get us where we needed to go. It was really my push to, like I said earlier, understand the problem space and to really go out and speak to consumers directly. We took the whole team because it was important to make sure that it wasn't just a research report, or that it was someone's particular idea or position that they were trying to sell back into the team. We would all learn these insights together. That's also a really critical learning for the team, was to move beyond just maybe observational research, like, oh, look what they're doing, that must be important, let's just learn from that. But also listening and asking the question why 5 times to really uncover what really they're thinking and what their real emotion is around it. So out of a set of key insights, which is really observation matched to motivation, that's a key connection, I think, that I helped maybe educate some of the folks on the team, is it isn't just statistics, it isn't just answering questions, but really digging in to understand the why. And from that, we were able to craft more meaningful personas of different tennis players beyond maybe just their skill set or age, and move into more of an understanding of their motivations for playing tennis as a component of how they play and how they need support from their equipment to play in a more effective way. Using some visual mapping tools was a way to kind of bring not only the team together about understanding what problem space was and where the opportunity was, but to also communicate to upper management as well as the go-to-market teams, which are super influential as to whether a product actually ends up in the marketplace, was highly derived from very traditional stakeholders in your organization that were very well educated about the industry and products that perform well in the industry? How do you convince them that what you have is something that's unique? Telling stories through the lens of the consumer was important, as well as framing information in a visual way, which is a skill set of designers to really bring about what those insights were and where the opportunities were. So it helped really craft a space for this product that we've been talking about, but it also crafted opportunity spaces for how existing products might map in and could be improved even further. So it was a holistic research endeavor to really inform the entire category.
So it seems so simple and self-evident, talk to consumers, but when I think about sporting goods or sports where there's some type of equipment, be it tennis or golf or cycling, and you see all the marketing or you read all the stories about how they were developed, it's all about tested with experts, built with Serena Williams or the Tiger Woods Golf Club. So how do you fit in that aspirational dimension that even your average weekend tennis player wants to use the same equipment as Serena or Roger?
You hit the nail on the head in terms of how the industry has traditionally operated, which was, on aspiration. I mentioned the Pro Staff racket, very aspirational product of, was heavily marketed. Roger Federer plays with that. And of course, little kids want to be Roger Federer when they grow up. So certainly there were versions of that racket that were made for junior players and recreational players that were easy to play with. But for what's termed the performance racket category, which was the more premium and capable products for more accomplished players, that's where the business was really driven from. That's where all the margin came from, and all the marketing dollars would go against those key franchises, basically 3 to 4 franchises of products with matching expert players on the Pro Tour that would help endorse that. We knew that in order to come up with a completely new product, that way of working was not going to get us where we needed to go. Because as I mentioned, a pro player is not going to be willing to change to a completely different racket midway in their career. It's just way too risky. They start with a racket in their early teens, and it's very difficult to get them to actually shift off of that. Now, there are endorsement deals and those kinds of things. That's a whole different business model conversation about, hey, here's $1 million a year to switch to our product. But by and large, they're in there playing with the very similar or same racket. It just has different branding on it, that type of thing. It's kind of like stock car racing or those kinds of things. We knew that we had to convince real consumers and the retail channels that drove the business, the Tennis Warehouses of the world, that selling online was very much a shift that was been going on for the last 10, 15 years, as well as the mom and pop retail shops that were still a big part of how tennis is sold, not unlike bike shops and things like that. Now that's been changing, but it's still super influential. So how do you convince all those people that you have something meaningful? And it really came down to they had to try the product. And because it was so immediately visceral and recognizable as being different and beneficial, that word of mouth just went crazy. One of the other things that was really cool about the marketing effort was it kind of transcended maybe the traditional way of just convincing retailers, but also using influencers through social media was maybe the first real attempt by a big brand in tennis to launch a new product. And I'll hold up for you just for your benefit, but this was Clash before it was ever decorated with branding graphics, and it was put what we call like a dazzle camouflage pattern on it, kind of like how car companies will launch or test prototypes out in the world. They try to hide what the product really looks like. I believe 100 of these rackets were packaged up in a very careful way and sent to influencers around the world that were very capable tennis players, but influential in terms of how they conveyed and reviewed products. So this was just maybe a guerrilla way of getting under and getting levels of endorsement from people who were not being paid. They were offered a free product to test, but it was a way to create buzz months and months before the launch of the product. So there was a lot of pent-up demand because people knew that these influencers using this product were posting videos and whatnot about what was coming. but they were also embargoed on, really sharing what the final product was going to look like until the launch day. So there was classic marketing, like the way that this Nike and others try to launch shoes. There's a lot of pent up demand for what's coming next. So that was a unique marketing approach that really married apparel world or that kind of thing with hard goods marketing. So I think that was of equal importance that the product was kind of introduced in a very unique way that helped create buzz. But ultimately, the product had to deliver a real benefit.
So let's look at the other side of the equation. You got tennis rackets, big revenue stream. You can definitely see how innovation can play a role there in marketing and celebrity endorsements and having the right narratives, influencers, everything. The other side of the equation, I assume tennis balls are a fairly big revenue maker. What does innovation look like there?
I think the tennis ball and that business was equal in size to the one that I just mentioned in terms of the rackets. So it was super important to the business. The challenge was that it had really shrunk in the last maybe 10 years. It was like half of its size because of the commoditization of the product itself. It became a price war, either through private label or the closest competitors just driving price down. So it was a race to the bottom. The only thing that could really stand in the way was, brand recognition. So creating what, quote, would be the best ball used for the key tournaments in the world, like the US Open was the name of the best ball that Wilson makes. And it's priced accordingly. It's a premium offering, premium product, and the best players know that it performs amazingly. So I guess you could say that's an aspirational purchase. But by and large, tennis players who play every week, every month, were buying in bulk. Online, it was very much commodity. So really taking a fundamental different look at the business model was an innovation approach beyond just making the product different. As I mentioned, there's always been R&D efforts to figure out a different way to make the product, either make it less expensive or make it more efficiently or leverage different materials so that it could provide a slightly different performance offering. And through all that kinds of experimenting internally, Wilson had the capability from an engineering and material science perspective to really look at the tennis ball through a different lens, make it with a different material, a different thickness, a different kind of felt. All these things were all components to a product, but ultimately what they learned is that the product was immensely durable, outlasted any other product by many times. It was a really interesting conversation internally to say, well, this doesn't really solve our problem because now people won't buy more tennis balls. But people weren't really thinking through the lens of business model shift, where if you could get people to switch and still share, that's a much better equation. That's dollars and cents versus just measuring market share or purchase reorder and things like that, which was a common KPI for this business. We had a product, but we didn't really know how to sell it. And marrying that with insights around what consumers really care about, and sustainability was one that kept rising to the top, and Wilson didn't necessarily have the best way of answering that problem for consumers. But recognizing that tennis balls take up a lot of room in landfills, they're not easily recycled, and there certainly were recycling efforts going on with partnerships and things like that to recover what was there and turn tennis balls into new tennis courts, as an example. And that was noteworthy. But if you could get consumers to actually use a tennis ball 3 times longer, it will transcend the end state in a much more rapid way. And it can be a premium offering that you can charge for and get recognition for. So one of the other things was that the ball didn't need to be pressurized, didn't need to be packaged in a plastic canister that is single-use plastic packaging waste, difficult to deal with, certainly can be recycled, but still there was quite a push to find another way to package the product. So this new product called Trinity was able to be packaged in a basic paperboard package that was made from recycled paper and could be easily recycled and could tell a very clear visual story in the marketplace. But it had to kind of stand above what had been very commodity products, which were also sold, in unpressurized cans, like training balls and things like that you just don't charge a lot of money for, were also sold in that kind of condition. So it was about how do you position it as premium, How do you position it as an answer to a sustainability consumer care and also deliver on performance? So it still provides a great tennis experience. And so that's why they called it Trinity, because it answered those three things. It's a great story, and it's heavily endorsed on tour by a lot of pro athletes who certainly have their own cause marketing, challenges that they want to make sure that they have something that they can talk about and support.
What advice would you have for someone is driving new ways of working? How can they sell in new ways of working or new ideas that go counter to what an organization might have been doing for decades?
It's a classic change management conversation, using design as a way to carry the conversation for the consumer needs, as well as how that can come about through a creative process. I feel created a level of empowerment with the people who could influence throughout the organization. One of the biggest challenges is convincing people who think they already know the answer with different information. And what was noteworthy is that data doesn't always get you that far. You hear a lot about data, big data, all these things driving key decisions out in the business world. And we had all the data we needed for the Clash racket to be a winner. And it still wasn't convincing until we were able to tell the right kinds of stories. So I think really being able to certainly support the effort through data, that it was meaningful, it was measurable. There were real consumers out there that were convinced that it was a good product, worthy of investment, worthy of launching, these types of things. But the ability to be able to tell the stories through that lens in an effective way was really, really important. And I think being able to just appeal to people's own experiences, even if it wasn't the right tennis racket for them personally, getting them to really have empathy for what the consumer experience is, I think was a transcendent component of getting that change to take place and really getting people to focus on the consumer versus their own personal experiences. Because as I mentioned, even before we started on this podcast, there's a lot of great tennis players that work in the business, and their ideas and perceptions are very, very valuable, but they're not necessarily the consumers. And I think that was main message, was really get people to think more critically around what the real consumer experience was.
Fantastic. Well, this has been hugely fascinating for me, having played tennis growing up, but never really thinking about why I was buying a particular racket or what innovation was going into it. And perhaps even falling victim to some clever marketing about shock absorption.
Yeah, I'm sure it was measurable. But,
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all your insights around driving innovation in a more legacy product type of environment.
Yeah, it's a challenge for lots of different companies, definitely in the sports world for sure. Fiercely competitive out there. So if you can bring real meaningful solutions that solve real problems, what was interesting is the product basically sells itself. That's what Wilson had great success back in the early 90s with a product that just basically sold itself. And it was called the Profile. And, they wanted to see if they could get back to something like that. And we were able to deliver on that. So I think that was what ultimately was a great satisfier for the team, for the company. And knowing that it was a contribution across a lot of different functions in the company, I think was noteworthy as well.
As a product designer, innovator, and team player, Tim took on a very traditional industry, sporting goods. He elevated design from a supporting role to a strategic level to drive innovation and accelerate growth in Wilson's racket sports and tennis business. Working cross-functionally, Tim redirected the usual conversation around tennis rackets and balls in order to identify real customer problems and focus on consumer-led solutions. And that's our show. Connect with Tim on LinkedIn and learn more about Wilson Sporting Goods at wilson.com. Finally, here at Feedback Loop, we're always in search of product management thought leaders to share their insights on This is Product Management. If you or anyone in your network has experience launching innovative products or building world-class product teams, then please reach out. Just visit feedbackloop.com and get in touch via the Contact Us page. Until next time, this is Verma from Feedback Loop.